Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to the Scary Stories NYC Scary Saturday Serials Complete Saga Chapter 2, entitled Mom Said Werewolves Aren't Real. This chapter comes after the 2-hour opening chapter and before Chapter 3, which is entitled Alone with the Dogman. Let's jump right into the story. We've got the new chapter of Brian's lichen troubles, and we've got another all-new Dogman story we're chopping up into chapters and calling Life with Dogman. That's about a person who has lived on the same property his entire life and who swears that multiple dogmen share the property with him and his family. But first, let's pick up on what happened next to Brian and Jenny. Without further ado, let's jump straight into Brian Lycanthrope, the new chapter. Brian and Jenny woke up while walking down a dirt road lined with tall corn on either side. They had no idea where they were. Jenny turned to Brian and screamed. He screamed back. Neither of them recognized each other, and neither did either of them remember who they were. Jenny was wearing a black head covering, a white bow blouse, and a midi-length black skirt with sensible black shoes. Brian found nothing threatening about her except for the fact that she seemed terrified of him and wouldn't stop screaming. He took stock of himself and saw that he was wearing a similarly black and white business outfit. Both of them had silver crosses pinned to them. Both were carrying Bibles. Opening his, Brian saw that the book had a label inside saying, "I belong to," followed by a line. Handwritten over that line was a name: Brian McGrath. He said the name out loud. Brian McGrath. It didn't sound familiar, but it did confuse the girl enough to get her to stop screaming. "What did you say?" she asked with a quavering voice. "I think it's my name," he answered. Is there a name in yours?" he asked. Jenny launched into some kind of tirade about how she didn't know who she was or what he was trying to get away with. But I don't know who I am either," Brian interrupted. "Do you know who you are?" Jenny stopped and thought. She couldn't even remember her own name. She began hyperventilating. Brian suggested she open her Bible and see who it said it belonged to. Nervous and confused, she opened the book and read the label out loud. "I belong to Jenny McGrath." "McGrath," she said, staring up at Brian. "Does this mean we're married?" I guess," Brian thought out loud. "Unless you're my sister. I suppose there is a big difference between the two." Jenny's head was spinning. At least this guy wasn't going to hurt her. He was family in some way, either by blood or by marriage. In the meantime, at least she had an ally in trying to figure out what she was going through. She hugged Brian and cried, moaning, "What do we do?" over and over. Brian let her hug him as long as she wanted, since he had no idea what their next move should be, and he needed more time to think. The sun was almost directly overhead, and it was baking the entire area, most especially Brian's brain. A pickup truck drove up, raising big clouds of dust behind it. The two moved a bit into the rows of corn to give the truck room to pass. It slowed to a stop, and a smiling middle-aged couple wearing their Sunday best smiled back out at them. The man spoke, asking them in a friendly way if they were lost and where they were trying to get to. Brian and Jenny looked at each other, neither of them knowing how to answer either question. The woman told her husband to let the young couple into their cab. They were clearly suffering from heat stroke. She insisted that Brian and Jenny come to their house for some lunch and some cooling lemonade. Before they knew it, all four were riding together, and the older couple were telling them with excitement about their morning church service they had just come from. Jenny asked, "So, does that mean this is Sunday?" The lady regarded Jenny with pity and urged her husband to drive faster. On the way, the middle-aged duo explained they were named the Coopers and their only daughter was away at college, so Brian and Jenny could stay with them for a few days if they needed to get their bearings before moving on. Neither Brian nor Jenny responded to this offer, since they were still trying to remember who they each were, and were not back up to figuring out what they might need for survival yet. At the Cooper's home, eating a hearty meal, the younger couple began to feel a bit more human for the first time since waking up in that cornfield. Not much more human, but they were able to say please and thank you when passing the food around the table for each other. Now Mr. Cooper began to ask them what church they were from. Neither knew, so Brian opened his Bible, which said Missouri Synod on the inside front cover. Those words meant nothing to either of the Coopers or Brian or Jenny. It seemed they were Protestant, but that was about all any of the four of them had been able to deduce. Mrs. Cooper tried to lighten things by joking around about how the more they learned of these two young strays, the more of a mystery they seemed. The other three tried to laugh and smile at her weak attempts at humor, but nobody thought the situation was very funny. Disturbing? Yes. Worrying? Yes. Frightening? Maybe. But funny? Not in the least, not to them anyway. Brian seemed more concerned than the rest. Not only did he seem unhappy, he seemed in physical discomfort. Sweating, he asked where the bathroom was. While receiving directions, he stood up to follow them, but he never made it, even one single step. Collapsing to his knees, Brian began screaming in both shock and pain. Something horrible was happening to him, and he was terrified because on top of the sharp pains and discomfort, he had no idea what was going on. He made an attempt to stand but stumbled back to his knees. He made another attempt and fell flat on his face. All three got up and rushed around to greet him, but were shocked to find that Brian was no longer there. At least, not the Brian they had been eating and chatting with. Now, there was some kind of hairy creature wearing Brian's clothing and writhing around on the floor. Screaming and backing up to give him space, they stared in shock at Brian, or what used to be Brian. Finally, Mr. Cooper suggested strongly to his wife that she call for an ambulance. He thought it might be some kind of epileptic fit that Brian was suffering. Certainly it was nothing that he or his wife could help the young man with. He needed to see a professional. But a professional what? Before Mrs. Cooper could get anywhere near the house phone, the hairy thing that used to be Brian reared up off the floor. It was now much larger than it had been as a human, and Brian's shirt and jacket were ripped to shreds in the act of his growing larger. It was like a Hulk transformation, only this Hulk was covered in fur all over, and its head no longer resembled that of a human or even a primate. This thing now had a head that resembled a dog or a canine, much more than it resembled any other type of creature. When Mrs. Cooper's brain took in Brian's new appearance, it shut down, and she collapsed into unconsciousness. That was probably for the best, as the enraged, wolf-headed bear man thing tore that entire room apart in rage. At first, it just seemed insane, but soon it became apparent that it was frightened and looking for a way out of the room it found itself trapped in. Jenny, apparently unafraid of the hairy man thing in front of her, shouted at Brian to calm down, to stop breaking everything. The huge creature stopped and looked Jenny in the eye. She did not fear to look back at him, and he growled at her, inching closer. Mr. Cooper urged the girl to get away slowly and to stop looking Brian in the eye. She completely ignored him and kept staring into Brian's eyes, telling him he didn't have to do this. He didn't have to destroy everything. The immense monster stopped growling and inched closer to her, smelling her face and her eyes, then her shoulders. "Get away from that thing, girl," ordered Mr. Cooper, as quietly yet as forcefully as he could. Brian looked at Mr. Cooper and growled. Mr. Cooper held his hands up in front of himself defensively and followed his own advice, backing away and not looking Brian in the eyes. Brian went back to sniffing Jenny, and she went back to talking soothingly to him. Then, suddenly, and without any warning, Brian reached out and grabbed Jenny by her waist with both of his hand-like claws, and he hurled her up in the air, swinging her body backwards over him. Her sensible shoes grazed the ceiling of the room, and she landed with a frightened squeal on Brian's expansive and muscular back. Before she'd even landed, Brian had propelled himself through the picture window in the back of the house. Jenny screamed and held onto patches of his fur, barely preventing herself from flying off his back as the two of them flew through the picture window, making an ear-shattering crash and sending glass and wood in every single direction. Brian ran towards the woods off in the distance, Jenny screeching and barely clinging to him in the process. Mr. Cooper looked at the mess that used to be his home and called an ambulance to come take his wife to the hospital. Then he started taking photos for insurance purposes. What else do you do after a werewolf ransacks your home? You go right back to doing real-world things. When the paramedics arrived, so did a couple of police. They asked Mr. Cooper what happened, and as he opened his mouth to tell them, his world went dark, and he fainted dead away, landing on the floor next to his wife. Brian woke up on the forest floor, Jenny attending to a wound that was throbbing on his right arm. She had undone the bow from her blouse to use as a bandage and was dressing his wound. He wasn't wearing a shirt and seemed to have lost his jacket, but his pants were still on and intact, so that's something. Jenny, on the other hand, looked nearly perfect, other than her hair seeming a little wind-blown. Brian regarded her in the way one would regard an angel come to heal them. He had never seen such a beautiful person in his life, and his heart ached to kiss her. Then, smiling, Jenny leaned in and kissed him. Recoiling and sliding away on the forest floor, Brian reminded Jenny that they didn't remember who they even were. All they knew was that their last names were the same. They might be blood relatives for all they knew. He expressed these notions to Jenny and she just laughed in a relaxed manner. "I'm certain that's not the case," she told him, giggling. "I noticed this last night," she said, displaying a wedding ring on her left hand. Brian looked at his own hand and found no ring there. "All that proves," he said, "is that you're married to someone. If it were me, I'd have a ring on my hand, too." Still giggling, Jenny responded, "Not if you turned into a werewolf and the ring fell off." "A werewolf? A werewolf?" Suddenly, the memories of yesterday started to flood back into Brian's mind. He sat up quickly. Why were they on the floor of a forest? Why was his shirt gone? How had he gotten wounded? He wondered about all these things, but the first question that came out of his mouth asked where the old couple had gone. Weren't they planning on spending the night with them? What had actually happened? Jenny told him her version of what had happened. According to her, he had transformed into what she described as a quote-unquote magnificent beast, and he had carried her off. She left out some of the details regarding how he had smashed up the place and made the old lady faint because Jenny was clearly in love with Brian. He wasn't a troubled man who turned into a monster to Jenny. No, he was a knight in shining armor who swept her off her feet in a literal fashion and carried her off with him. "I was waiting for you to wake up before I went into town," she said. "Went into town?" he asked, confused. "Yes, we need to get you a new shirt," said Jenny. "Then after you look decent again, we need to get breakfast." She was right. He couldn't go to a diner or anywhere else without a shirt on. His mind raced, trying to make sense of things. "Wait," Brian asked, "what will we buy clothes or food with?" Jenny reached into the pocket in her skirt and pulled out a wad of $1 and $5 bills. "We've got a little over $200, she informed him. "I found most of it in your pants pocket and the rest on me." "That's not gonna last us long," Brian mused to himself as much as to her. "It'll buy us a shirt, and it'll buy us a breakfast," she responded. "And once we have food in our bellies, it'll be a lot easier to think of what to do next." Flash forward to about 150 minutes later. The two of them have regrouped, gone to a diner, and just finished eating. "I thought you said it would be easier to decide what to do after we ate," Brian said. "All I want to do now is take a long nap." "Do we have enough for a motel room?" "Definitely not," answered Jenny. "We're going to need to raise more funding somehow, and soon." "Ha!" retorted Brian. "Raise funding. It's like you see us running through the woods as a Kickstarter project." They both had a laugh together, and Brian felt his heart beat harder and louder. Why was that? Just because she laughed? Brian felt such intense attraction to this girl, and something else too. Was that love? It was exciting just to be near her. Smiling, she put her hand on his, and Brian felt himself blushing. She clearly loved him, and that made it impossible for him not to return the emotion. But reality was weighing heavily on Brian. He had experienced a blackout and remembered nothing about what had happened after he supposedly turned into a werewolf. Jenny said he changed into a monster and ran off with her. Either she was crazy, or he really was some kind of a werewolf thing. Now his heart began beating harder, not out of love, but out of a sense of panic. "Where will we go?" he asked, increasingly frantic. He added more questions on top of that one. "How will we eat? Where will we sleep? How will we survive? What will we do?" Smiling and gripping his hand a little harder, Jenny spoke soothingly and answered, "I don't know, Brian, but I know we'll do it together." Mesmerized in each other's presence, the two 20-somethings leaned across their dirty dishes and kissed. They were lost in their own world, completely unaware of anyone or anything around them, until their bliss was cut off by the busboy clearing his throat. "Excuse me," he said sheepishly. I need to clear your table. We have people waiting to be seated." Walking outside through the small town, Brian wondered if Jenny was telling him the truth about what had happened during his blackout. How could it possibly be true? Werewolves aren't real. But if he hadn't changed into one, then what really had happened? Was Jenny insane? Was she tricking him in some manner? He figured he should question her a bit, see if her answers were consistent, or if he could catch her in a lie. "Jenny," he began, "what are we gonna do when I change into a werewolf again tonight?" Jenny giggled and flirtatiously told him they wouldn't have to worry about that for another month. Werewolves, she reminded him, only transformed on the night of the full moon. Then, smiling, she tapped him on the forehead and asked, "Remember, silly?" Jenny leaned in and kissed him, and Brian did his best to return the favor, but his mind was elsewhere. Jenny pulled back, still smiling, and grabbed his hand. "Let's go in this store," she said, dragging him inside before he could even see what kind of store it was. "Sporting goods?" asked Brian once inside. "Are you in the mood for tennis or something?" Jenny shushed Brian, looking around nervously. Speaking quietly and dragging him deeper into the store, she reminded him that they needed housing. That made no sense to Brian until he spotted where he was being led. The camping section. She was going to buy them a tent, a backpack, and one large sleeping bag, with most of their remaining money. Outside again, Brian asked if the stuff they got was durable enough to actually camp with. They had bought the cheapest things they could, and nothing looked really top-notch to him. "Would you rather sleep on dirt?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "I don't see why you're complaining anyway. You're not the one who's going to have to camp in a skirt." That was true. He wasn't. Walking for about a half hour out of the town, they eventually reached the woods, which had a small river, or a large stream, running through it. "Shouldn't we have bought some food while we were in town?" asked Brian, but Jenny motioned to the river. "Bodies of water are nature's supermarket," she informed him. "That's why I bought you this fishing pole and bait." Great, thought Brian. She spent our money buying food for the fish, but none for us. "This is a good place to set up camp," Jenny said, and took the backpack off Brian's back. "I don't actually know how to set up a tent," Brian said, and Jenny handed him the fishing gear in response. "Go fish," she said, giggling again. This was all weirdly entertaining to her, which only made Brian more paranoid than earlier. He was forming a response to the girl who seemed to be certain she was his wife, when a sudden, sharp pain gripped him. He thought he had been struck from behind, but saw nothing behind him. Then, a pain gripped Brian from the front and he collapsed to the ground. Jenny was immediately at his side, a concerned look on her face. "What is happening to me?" wailed Brian in a ragged voice. He looked like he was going into shock. Jenny's eyes were wide. "Oh no," she exclaimed. "I forgot. There are traditionally 3 nights of the full moon." The next thing that happened will be revealed in the next episode of Brian Lycanthrope. Now, don't go anywhere as we have a story of dogman habituation coming up right after this message.
I'm Madeline Starr, and you can join me here each week for Saturday Night Scary Serials. That's when we tell you a new chapter in the ongoing serialized life of Jenny, whose husband Brian turns into a large feral dogman that only she can control. Why is this happening to them? And who are the strange, partially hidden forces that seem to guide them along a path they never chose? Come back every Saturday night as I host another episode of Saturday Night Scary Serials right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel. It all begins August 31st.
Life with Dogman, Chapter 1. Dear Scary Stories, I have lived with habituation by what some people call Dogman on my property, going back to before it actually was my property. Back then, it used to belong to my parents and I was a kid. We lived far from any neighbors in those days. Now we have people living less than a 5-minute walk in either direction, but when I was young, we really were in the middle of nowhere. Since I had no brothers or sisters, I would usually play by myself. My parents were so busy just trying to survive that I was allowed to do what I wished on most summer days after my morning chores were done. I took to wandering a block over to where the woods were. They were really only a small patch of woods there, but they connected in the north side to a nationally protected park. So I would sometimes see fairly exotic animals like bears or cougar wandering through the woods. I learned early on how to watch out for and avoid them, and I never reported any of this to my parents. I knew they would ban me from spending time in that forest if they knew about the predators lurking inside it. I learned at an early age to be a kind of human version of a fly on the wall. I learned to exist in a place silently and watch nature walk all around me, sometimes within just a few feet, never reacting to me at all, as though I weren't there, or as though I were like one of the plants. I would have to be in a calm mood to start with for it to work, but if I was, then it would never fail. So, one day I saw a large dog in the woods, and I tried to silence myself and do my invisibility trick. I didn't want this large dog to notice me, but even though I had watched other carnivores in the past walking by and not flinched, something about this creature got me nervous. I tried to hold still but found myself shaking. I tried to be invisible but was stunned and horrified to see that thing turn its head and lock eyes with mine. I wanted to run, but I couldn't even stand up. I wanted to look away, but the creature held my gaze as though it had put my eyes in handcuffs. It was out of the woods and in the clearing with me less than 3 feet away, chest heaving air that smelled like death in and out of what must have been immense lungs. Although it was a dog, and the largest I'd ever seen, its angry eyes seemed to display some evil kind of intelligence. It loomed over me as I sat on the rock, sticking out of the ground in the clearing. I guessed it would still loom over me if I stood up, so I didn't. I watched the thing and heard it growl. I saw it bare its teeth, then noticed it hadn't been panting like any other dog would have been doing. It seemed to breathe through its nose, more like a cat or a human, not drooling with its tongue hanging out like a dog. Nevertheless, in appearance, it was a large, dark, muscular, shaggy dog. I don't think it was a bear with mange, as the fur was full and thick all over, even if it was shaggy as I had already mentioned. It had all sorts of little forest things tangled in its fur, but I couldn't see any skin through the hair, and the animal seemed to be in generally good health. I really to this day don't exactly know what these creatures are, but I know they are not bear, and I knew even then as a child that this was not any sort of bear. This was a dog, just a different kind of dog than any I'd ever seen before. Then, it did the most remarkable thing. It reared back up on its hind legs, and its growling grew louder. I beat it out of there back to the house, ran up to my room, and hid under the covers. I don't think the creature followed me, as I think it could have caught me easily if it had wanted to. Although nearly frightened out of my skin, and although I resolved to make certain to give this animal greater space in the future, I also got the distinct drift that it didn't want to eat me for dinner, and it didn't really want to hurt me if it didn't have to. That meant it was up to me to ensure I was respectful of its turf if I wanted to stay alive. I desperately wanted to learn more about predator behavior, but I knew I couldn't tell my father about this standing wolf. For the next couple of weeks, I would ask my mom to drive me into the nearest town so I could spend the day in the library, reading up on predators of the American wilderness and educating myself for what would become a lifelong pursuit of mine. Now that I'm much older, I find it's harder and harder to get to the woods, but I still sometimes see the creatures from my second-story house windows. I know they're still there. I feel it's time for me to write down as many of the encounters as I've had with them that I can remember. So I'm sending them to you for you to immortalize into videos for the YouTube. I live here now with my son and his children, and none of them as yet have seen the creatures, so I don't talk about it much to them. I do warn them about all the bear and cougar, and none of them even like strolling through the forest, so it hasn't become an issue. For these reasons and others, I can't really pass my stories down to my family. I choose instead to make you, all of you, my family, and to pass the stories on to you. And so, like I said, I didn't go back in the woods for a couple of weeks, and I read up on what animals were supposed to live in my area and how to avoid getting bitten or eaten by them. There was absolutely nothing in any of those books about overly large dogs that stood on their hind legs like a bear. I read up on bears and I read up on wild dogs, understanding that even if I prepared mightily for encountering both of them, I might not be prepared at all for an encounter with that dog bear thing, as I'd begun to call it. So, for the rest of that summer, I was on pins and needles when I would be in the forest, constantly wondering if the next thing I would hear would be that creature's growl, or the next thing I would see would be its teeth. After a while of not seeing anything out of the ordinary, I began to realize that the chances of ever seeing something like that again were probably very small. The chances of seeing something like that even once in a lifetime would probably be less than the chance to win the lottery, so to see one a second time would have to be almost mathematically impossible. Reassuring myself with my childlike trust of mathematics and random chance, I decided that the forest was now safe for me. Seeing a monster once must be sort of like being inoculated against a disease, since it seemed to mathematically reduce your chances to witness the same phenomenon a second time. I didn't realize that the numbers in your head don't always translate to the predicted results out in the real world. One day, I fell asleep on my rock in the woods. When I woke up, it was getting dark, and I was no longer alone. Looking up and being surprised by how late it was getting, I popped to my feet to run back home to see if I was late for dinner and in trouble yet. Once again, my sudden movement had startled a large creature, and once again, I had to stop everything and gauge exactly how much physical danger I was in before proceeding any further. Turning around to see what kind of creature I had put on alert, I saw it. The dog. The large dog from earlier. The one that stood like a bear. It wasn't standing like that though, it was on all fours, and it was looking as frightened of me as I was feeling frightened of it. I had read in the library that I should never look a frightened animal, especially not a predator, in the eyes, yet for some reason I couldn't break my eyes away from those of this thing. Maybe it's because those eyes shone a bright yellow and were not dark like most canine eyes. I hadn't noticed that the last time, maybe because the sighting occurred when it was brighter out. I backed away slowly, saying something like, "Good boy, nice boy" to it as though it were someone's family pet. When I got 4 or 5 steps back, the thing rose up, just like last time. This time, however, when it rose to full height, it seemed even larger than it had the previous time. It also seemed to have a lighter colored, spotty underbelly, when it definitely had a dark, evenly colored underbelly last time. My muddled thinking worked for a while to understand how this creature had changed so much in the 6 weeks since I had last seen it, when suddenly I understood. This was not that creature. This was a different giant dog that stood like a bear. How many of them were there in these parts? Apparently enough for a breeding population. I shuddered all over at the thought that there might be more of the creatures in the woods around me. I might have been surrounded while I slept without any awareness of it. I panicked and ran away. I ran through the trees, taking what I hoped would be a shortcut home. It was littered with thorn bushes and branches that whipped and cut me as I sped past them. But as much noise as I was making there in the woods trying to get home, something was making an even bigger noise behind me. Was it that large dog chasing me? Or was it multiple large dogs now after me? I didn't have the nerve to slow down or look behind. I just ran until I saw the clearing leading to my parents' house coming up. Then I began shouting and running even faster. Once in that clearing, I turned and saw what was chasing me. It was the large dog, all right, but it wasn't running after me. It was just sort of walking and jogging behind me on its hind legs the entire time. It didn't seem to want to catch me. It just seemed curious and wanted to know where I was running off to. It was easily able to keep up with my running without exerting much effort because its legs were so much longer than mine. I made it to our back door, but instead of going inside, I stopped and watched the dog-headed bear man standing just this side of the wood line, standing there and watching me back. Will this be the last time I ever see you, I wondered. You will have a lifetime to get to see me, came the answer in my head. I don't know if I imagined that answer or what, but once I had received the information, that creature turned and disappeared back into the forest. Life with Dogman Part 2, Stare Down with a Dogman. Back in school the next autumn, I told nobody about the dogman I saw, and so when I was there in school, things felt normal and like they had been before this all started. I learned this way to never talk about the dogman and to keep all of this to myself. Even though I had begun to love going to school just because I could be certain I would never see a dogman there or get made fun of for seeing a dogman. Once the bell rang and we all got out, I always went straight back to the woods. To be alone, I told myself. I didn't actually want anyone to come over to my house since I couldn't trust my family not to tell my friends I claimed to see monsters in the woods. My family were people who enjoyed mocking each other ferociously. My mom would always show my most embarrassing baby pictures to every one of my friends who she got to meet, and I was certain she was already rehearsing her "my crazy son thinks dogs can walk on their hind legs" comedy routine to humiliate me and ruin my friendships. So like I said, I would hang out in the forest, claiming I wanted to be alone. But maybe, just maybe, my real goal was to see one of those dogmen again. After all, the underbelly of the first one was dark, and the second one revealed spotted fur on its underside when it stood up. If there were 2 of them, then most likely there were dozens of them out there, Although still terrified of the dogmen, they hadn't ever hurt me or made me feel I was under attack. So I guess it really was not a true quote-unquote afraid for my life kind of fear. It was more like a quote-unquote really scary horror movie level of fright. As upsetting as it had been to be chased by them, they had let me go both times and they could have caught me. Although I told myself I never wanted to see them again, looking back on it, I think on some level, I was there in the forest each day it wasn't raining, hoping to see them again. I remember it got too cold to be outside eventually, and I would sit in my bedroom, staring out at the forest from the second floor, wishing I could be there. Then, that year in the fall, we had a sudden warm spell. I beat it to the forest to do my homework on my favorite rock. The ground was wet, and so was the stone, but I didn't care because it was warm and sunny, and I was back in the forest where I wanted to be. I finished all my homework and stuck around afterward, appreciating the woods that I had been missing so badly. It started to get a little late in the day and the sky began darkening. Disappointed, but resigned to the reality of the situation, I got up to walk home. I decided to take a more roundabout path home, just to make it take longer. After all, dinner was still a half hour away, and my homework was done, so it wasn't like I really had any reason to rush. Then, walking along the path, I began to hear a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. It sounded like either a big cat or a big dog, growling. Not just a growl, but it had a kind of angry whine mixed in with it. I decided I'd better walk faster, but my legs disagreed and froze in position. I stood there in the muddy forest, looking around. The growling seemed to be coming from every direction, so I genuinely wasn't certain which way I should move in or away from. This seemed to last for an extremely long time. It felt like 5 or 10 minutes, but I was a kid, so maybe it was really only 15 or 20 seconds. In that time, I didn't see where the growl came from, but I did notice animal tracks in the mud all around me. Something large had been walking around there. Maybe I had wandered into the hunting grounds of one or more of the dog-like animals. There came a rustling of leaves in front of me, and what I saw made me fall back on my butt in the mud. It was the granddaddy of all dogmen. This guy had to be a half size taller than any of the previous creatures I'd seen, and he looked messed up. I remember his fur was very close cropped and sort of a reddish brown. His face was scarred, including just below one of his eyes. This creature was unlike the others in attitude, and he seemed hungry. I tried to look away, but found myself unable to. The monster dog thing's eyes shone, not yellow like the other one, but far more red. I felt hypnotized and unable to move. I wondered if I were dreaming. It was that surreal a situation. It was like when you wake up in bed and you can't move and you can't scream and you see something in your bedroom that shouldn't be there. The difference with this situation was that I knew I was awake. I could feel the wet, muddy dirt I was sitting on. I could feel it through my pants and I could feel it with my hands. And that wasn't something I was imagining in front of me or dreaming. That was actually there. I could smell the intense zoo smell, and there was no denying that this thing seemed to be edging closer to me while I remained planted in place. The sound of the growling seemed to melt into the sound of rushing water, and the entire scene seemed to fade away until nothing was left but the redness of the eyes of the dogman. My entire field of vision became red, yet it was such a soothing kind of red. The water sounded so beautiful. It filled not just my ears or my head, but my entire consciousness. It was like there was nothing else in my life but what this creature put there. And then, suddenly, that was all gone, and I was in the forest, and it had grown darker. The eyes were gone. The big red dogman wasn't there either. I stood up, confused, wondering what had happened. But I didn't have to wonder for long. Flying out of the trees to my left and continuing on into the woods to my right came that red dogman. I screamed, but it wasn't at all interested in me any longer. Again, I didn't have to wonder why for long, as he was quickly followed by a very dark creature the size of a bear. It happened too quickly for me to see clearly, so I didn't really know what it was. I just knew it had the vicious, hypnotic dogman on the run. I immediately bolted for home, running as fast as I could and forgetting my school books entirely. As I ran, it sounded like giant things were crashing through the forest alongside to my right, keeping pace with me. I was crying and whimpering now, trying in vain to run faster than whatever that was I was hearing. Soon, it wasn't just running and crashing sounds, but snarling and vicious kind of fighting sounds. I also heard yelps of pain that only made me cry harder. This was not a place for me to be. I remember running so hard that it almost became like someone else was doing the running. It was nearly an out-of-body experience, the first time I had gone through something so intense in my young life. And then I had to stop running as two great monstrous beasts spilled out onto the path in front of me and savagely rolled across the dirt road, each trying to permanently damage the other one. I never saw fur flying like that, as you could barely see through it. The large black one was on top of the red dogman, who seemed to be losing the fight. With one acrobatic motion, the red monster somehow squeezed out from under the other one, knocking him onto the dirt in the process. I saw the red thing utilize its chance to race away into the trees again, and the darker dogman fell back, momentarily winded. It was filling the entire dirt path before me, blocking my way to home and safety, so I had little choice but to remain there, staring. When it lifted its head, I could see it clearly for the first time, and then it looked up and our eyes met. I was there, defenseless, only a few feet in front of. Well, why don't we explain that part next? We'll be right back with the all-new installment of Brian Lycanthrope. Jenny watched Brian convulsing on the ground and knew what it meant. He was transforming again. She had thought they were both safe for another month, but no. She had forgotten that there were 3 nights of the full moon for the full-on lycanthropes. She had not feared Brian when he transformed the last time. It was as though she had lived through it before many times. She must have. The amnesia they both suffered from may have been very real, but the feelings in her body were the same, no matter what her conscious mind was now incapable of remembering. Something about this transformation felt different to her, and Jenny felt true fear. It's just because this was unexpected, she told herself. Still, She was afraid to approach the man she was convinced was her husband. What was she afraid of? At that moment, Brian turned and snarled at her, revealing fangs like those of a panther, and she backed away. There was a sense of anger about this transformation that was unlike the previous one. She tried to speak to Brian, but he writhed in pain and made it clear she'd better keep her distance. What was happening? What was going wrong? Once the transformation was complete, Brian squatted on the earth, panting heavily, and clearly still in pain from what had happened. Forcing herself to move forward, Jenny gingerly stepped closer to the beast man and spoke soothingly to him. The creature that was sometimes Brian turned quickly toward her, surprising Jenny. She jumped a little backward, then continued speaking as soothingly as she could. Her voice quavered, and she stuttered, but she reminded Brian of who he was and who she was, and that they loved each other. He quickly moved forward and sniffed her roughly. He wasn't acting like he recognized her, but he wasn't acting like he was going to eat her either. Tears began streaming from Jenny's eyes, and it took all her strength not to sob openly. Why was she so afraid of him? He stood up and began looking around. Jenny knew he was about to run off and begged him to take her with him. No matter how afraid she was of Brian at that moment, she was more frightened of being left alone in the forest at night. Brian was gone, just like that. He chose a direction and he ran off and was gone. Jenny was alone, completely alone, and she didn't know where Brian would wake up or if they would ever see each other again. Weeping, she climbed into the tent and zipped it up. Then she got in the sleeping bag built for 2 people to sleep in and felt incredibly alone. That wouldn't last for long, as she soon heard footfalls outside the tent. Not wanting to make a sound, she held her breath as long as she could, straining her ears to hear what was out there. Jenny took as few breaths as she could manage, as silently as she could manage, and she had no idea if she was in danger or not. It's a deer, she told herself. It's a raccoon. It's a possum. It's a squirrel. The more she told herself it was something harmless, the less she believed herself, and the harder it became to sleep. Why wouldn't it go away? What was it doing out there? Was it going to stay until dawn? Or was it going to try to get in the tent? Jenny could smell it now. It was large. If it was a deer, it was a buck or a family of deer. But why would a deer roam around her camp for so long? The more she tried to tell herself she was safe, the more she convinced herself that she was listening to a predator. And that's when the growling started. She felt it in the ground underneath her first, before her ears really heard it. That was a deep growling, and so it had to be a large animal. It had to be a predator. Jenny shook all over in her sleeping bag. Something was outside the tent, and Brian had reverted to his lichen form and run off. She would feel sad about the idea that she might never see him again, but right now, she was afraid for her life. Every sense and thought were locked into the present moment, as she didn't know if she had any future left ahead of her. Whatever was out there, it had to be a predator. It made growling noises. Was it Brian? She had no sense that it was. either in terms of the five senses or in terms of any instinct inside her. It felt like it was something different, yet equally as dangerous. The next thing that happened confirmed her fears and clued her into what was actually happening, both at the same time. Huge, long, sharp claws stuck themselves through the tent itself. Those looked like cat claws, only the longest cat claws Jenny had ever seen. The paw connected with them must have been as large as her hand. Then she saw the impression of that hand-sized claw as it tried to reach into her tent, stretching the tent fabric almost to its breaking point. What was it reaching for? Jenny looked and at once saw that she herself had placed herself in danger. She had food in the tent with her, a plastic bag full of sandwich makings, and that big mountain lion, or whatever it was, outside. It wanted her food. That seemed like a fair trade to Jenny, as she realized she had to get the food out of the tent somehow without getting mauled by the monster. Cautiously, slowly, Jenny sat up and slid over toward the zipper in the front entrance of the tent, so that now the claws were to her left in front and the zipper was to her right. In her head, she calculated that she would probably have the best chance of getting this done without getting hurt if she first unzipped the tent. That should attract the monster cat outside, away from the food, and toward the tent opening. She would have to grab the food at that point with her left hand, which was her weaker side, and toss the food outside fast, then zip up with her right hand. Simple. Except, both her hands were shaking and Jenny was shivering as though she were freezing. This was the do-or-die moment, and she felt like she was going to pass out from the stress. Unzip right, grab left, toss left, zip right. Unzip right, grab left, toss left, zip right. Deciding it was now or never, Jenny took a deep breath and unzipped the tent. Immediately, her life moved into slow motion as she witnessed the claws pulling back out of the tent. The beast must be coming around to the opening now. Grabbing the plastic bag of bread and sandwich meats with her left hand, Jenny flung it toward the tent opening, just as the big, tan-colored cat came to the tent entrance. The bag flew toward the opening and smacked right into the big cat's face, falling back inside the tent and landing on Jenny's lap. She looked up and saw the cat looking at her, then down to her lap. It sure looked hungry. Jenny froze and her mind shut off. She had nowhere to go. She had nothing more to do. Perfectly still like a statue, Jenny watched as the huge tan-colored monster began to move toward her. And then, suddenly, the cat stopped and its head went up. It was staring forward with a surprised expression on its face, but it was not looking at Jenny. It was staring past her. She had no idea of what this meant, or if it was something good or bad. Then, suddenly, the cat retreated very quickly without moving any of its limbs. How had it done that? The cat had basically flown backward out of her tent, pulling the tent flaps with it and giving her a better look outside. Yet all she saw out there was the cat, still looking very surprised, still sliding backward along the dirt. The tent flapped shut again, and Jenny remained there, frozen on her knees, stunned. Eventually, she grabbed the sandwich supplies and threw them outside the tent, zipping it up, then returning to her position on her knees, staring directly forward, unblinking. Her ears heard more than her mind could comprehend from then on. There was some kind of savage fighting going on outside. There was a conflict going on outside the tent, and there was another conflict going on inside Jenny's mind as she wondered what she could actually be doing in this situation. Probably exactly what she was doing, just staying still and hoping that whichever animal won the fight would be content to eat her sandwich makings and leave her alone. She was so tired that she wanted to go to sleep very badly. Part of her mind said it wouldn't matter if she died awake or asleep, and it wasn't like she could defend herself against a mountain lion if she was stuck inside her tent, and she couldn't defend herself any better against something that would attack a mountain lion. Jenny's mind began to resurface out of its state of shock as the problem began to bother her. What would attack a big wild cat? Jenny couldn't think of anything that would, but she wasn't sure how much she really knew about such things in her current state of amnesia, and wondered what was battling the wildcat. She heard the sound of something cat-like, screaming, almost like a woman, then heard it crash off into the woods as though running away. That meant that whatever had attacked it had won and must be directly outside the tent. As if to confirm her suspicion, Jenny could hear something consuming the contents of her sandwich bag. She grew more and more nervous, praying that this situation would soon be over and that the thing would go away once it was done eating. Would the food she threw out there be enough? It was going to feed both her and Brian. Surely enough food for 2 humans would be enough for this. What was it? A bear? Another mountain lion? What other kinds of predators could be out there? A wolf. It could possibly be a wolf, or even a feral dog of some kind. It couldn't be a coyote since they run in packs, and she could hear that this was only one beast, whatever it was. Holding as still as she could, and breathing as quietly as she could manage, Jenny knelt there and prayed and waited. She heard the thing finish eating, but she never heard it walk away. She listened as intently as she could, and after a while, she could hear it, still there, breathing. Why wouldn't it leave? Jenny's knees were beginning to ache. She was going to have to slide them out from under her and stretch them. She was going to have to risk making a noise and alerting whatever that was to her presence. She listened once more, hoping beyond hope that she wouldn't hear it out there. But sure enough, it was still breathing steadily. She imagined it was a bear or a wolf, and she wondered if it were staring directly in her direction. She wondered if it was listening to her, waiting for her to make a move. She had no choice, so Jenny shifted her weight and slid her right leg slowly out from under her. Then she did the same with her left, and as she finished, she felt a wince of pain and let out a little huff of breath at the end. She couldn't have prevented it. It was her body's decision, not hers. Breathing as quietly as she could, Jenny strained her ears to hear if the animal outside had noticed her movement. She held her breath for what seemed like the longest time, and then she heard it. She heard that immense, unseen predator and scavenger outside her tent. She heard it. Snoring. It had eaten its fill, and it had fallen asleep. As soon as her aching body would allow, Jenny slid quietly across the tent floor, and as slowly and carefully as she could manage. She unzipped the tent, only so far as it would take for her to peer out with one eye. When she looked out there, Jenny saw nothing but darkness. She had to wait for her eye to adjust to the darkness before she could make out the chest of a large, fur-covered animal laying on its side, breathing slowly in and out, in and out. It looked like it must be the size of a bear, but somehow something about it smelled familiar. Jenny was certain she had smelled that odor before. No longer caring about the sound she made, Jenny quickly unzipped the tent and saw it was Brian. He was still in his lichen form, but he'd come back to her. He had saved her life. Oh, he had eaten all the food she had bought without leaving her anything. Great. Immediately, Jenny went from a sense of relief to a feeling of self-pity. What was she going to eat if he was going to eat everything? Even though it was the middle of the night. Jenny's stomach grumbled, somehow hungry now that she was thinking about food. She was about to go back into the tent when she saw that Brian was sleeping partially on something brightly colored. She slipped it out from under him and saw it was a backpack. But it wasn't his backpack, and it wasn't hers either. Opening it up, Jenny saw something inside that made her gasp. Before she could even reach in and touch what she was looking at, Jenny heard a very distinct clicking sound and knew that something bad was about to happen. Looking up, Jenny saw something aimed directly at her that nobody would ever want to see aimed at them, and there was a man behind that particular metallic device, and that man was glaring directly at her. "Put down that backpack," the voice ordered her. "Then lay down flat with your face in the dirt." Find out what happens next in the ongoing tale of Brian's lichen troubles. I found myself facing the creature staring back at me on the dirt road. It was black like a black bear, and it was probably as big or even bigger than one. It had succeeded in chasing off the red-eyed dogman that had entranced me. And yet it had stopped its pursuit to remain by me. What was this thing? And was it going to chase me next? My heart was beating so fast, I thought I was going to die. My knees shook, and my hands as well. My face was wet with unending tears. Then the bear thing reared back, and I screamed in horror. It was now standing on its hind legs. I fell to the ground and covered my head, expecting the worst. When nothing happened, I risked looking up at the creature, and I saw it was not a bear. It was a dogman. It was that first dogman I had seen. I pushed myself back across the ground to put a little more distance between myself and the monster. Then, it did the last thing I would have expected it to do. It moved to the side, as though politely allowing me to pass it and resume my run home. I eyed that dirt path like I was eyeing a steak with French fries, but I didn't have the nerve to risk walking past something that large and that deadly. The creature seemed to understand my body language, and he dropped to all fours and turned to walk off into the forest to my right. I started getting myself up and preparing to run as soon as it seemed a safe distance away. But just before disappearing into the woods, the beast turned and gave me the saddest look. I said thank you to him, but I had no idea why. I judged it as a nervous reaction and ran home. It wasn't until a few days had passed that I came to understand that I thanked him because he had saved me. He had rescued me from the red-eyed dogman who had been somehow hypnotizing me or entrancing me. Who knows what might have happened if that large black monster had not intervened on my behalf. We had no more warm days that year, and I soon got caught up in the usual drama of going to school, and the forest fell toward the back of my mind. I won't say I forgot about the dogman because I couldn't. His look had left me feeling intensely guilty and sort of sad. Maybe he had no friends. Maybe he wanted to be mine. It was insane, though. I was just a kid, and a kid can't be a friend with an immense carnivore. That didn't stop me from feeling badly about it, though. When the spring came, I didn't go back to the forest. I had a new bunch of friends by then, and we mostly played on the property of the rich kid in the group. Let's call him Richie, which was not his real name. He was one of the few people I could talk to, but I didn't even tell him about any of the dogmen I had seen. Why? Because I wanted to keep him as my friend, that's why. Same reason I didn't tell anyone. Sometimes Richie and I would hang out together without the other guys, and we were sort of becoming best friends. His mom joked around that I was his twin brother, and I felt more accepted there than I ever did in my own house. His parents didn't seem to judge as harshly as mine did, and they forgave mistakes far more quickly. I sort of wished I could be his brother for real and have a family like that to grow up in instead of mine. One day, he and I wandered into the woods behind his house, which was about a quarter mile from mine. I wasn't thinking about the dogman. I was just hanging out with my friend and having fun. When it came time to head back, he wanted to stay longer. I asked him if he knew the way back to his house since I didn't. That was part of the woods that was unfamiliar to me. He assured me he did and that we were only 5 minutes from home, so I kept playing with him longer. Finally, it was actually getting darker out there, and I insisted we start to head back. It became apparent very soon that he had no idea what direction his home was in. I cursed myself for not paying more attention to where we were going, for not looking out for landmarks. I got scared immediately and wondered which way to go. And then we heard a growling. As much as I had not been thinking about the dogman before, that is exactly how much I was thinking of them right then. I remember Richie saw it first. His eyes were wide. He looked past me and he just pointed. I looked back and saw something in the trees moving back and forth. It was upright like a bear, but moving fast from side to side like an ape. I didn't know what it was, but I knew which direction I wanted to run in, and that was the direction pointing away from that tall, dark figure that was growling. We both ran, afraid for our lives. We reached a fork in the path and didn't know which way to go. Richie took the left path and I followed. That was when I heard something large in the trees to our left, something moving faster than we were. The thing was still chasing us. It was going to catch us. We could both hear the leaves and branches as well as see them move when whatever that was passed behind them. It was about to emerge onto the path in front of us when we both halted and ran back the way we came. When we reached the fork again, this time we took the other path. Now, we could hear the thing again, but from directly behind us. I expected it must be on the path, and that we could see it if we turned around. Richie got that idea just when I did, and I saw him turn around. He turned, and he screamed. Then he looked back forward and ran faster than ever. Something about that told me I might be better off not looking. We ran until suddenly I knew exactly where we were, that we were back on Richie's family's property. We were now racing toward the house, and I couldn't hear anything pursuing us. I needed to catch my breath, and I had to stop for a few seconds. It was then that I decided to risk a glance back the way we came. What I saw there was an image that got etched into my brain so hard that it could never leave my mind until the day I die. I was panting and almost ready to faint. The running and the fear were getting to be too much for me. I winced as I looked behind, half expecting to see the giant, hairy, impossible predator in mid-leap, about to eat me for dinner. Instead, I saw the dark dogman, the original dogman, the one that possibly saved me that one time. He wasn't running after me. He was sitting just inside the wood line. He looked like a giant version of a house pet, sitting just like a dog would. He was panting, just the same as I was. It almost made me laugh. There was no malice in that creature's eyes. I began to relax, no longer fearing for my life. The massive beast's head disappeared down behind some foliage, and when it came back up again, it was holding something bright and red in its mouth. I began jogging over to see better what it was. The color was very familiar. The dogman flipped the object over the bush where it landed on the grass. I sped up to see what he had tossed. Then the dark creature stood up, like a man on his hind legs. That slowed me down all right. That thing was more than twice my size. I froze to a halt, suddenly realizing again that this was a giant predator that I was running directly toward. Even if it meant me no harm, it, or he, was so large and feral, I might get hurt just by accident. Turning and dropping to all fours in the same movement, the big dog trotted back into the forest, leaving me alone. When I jogged closer, I recognized what he had tossed. It was my friend Richie's St. Louis Cardinals baseball cap. I retrieved it and walked slowly back to Richie's house, wondering about a number of different things. Why had the dogman flipped me the hat with its mouth like a house pet, when it had hand-like claws and could have just flipped it toward me the way a human would? Also, had it just saved me again? When I got back inside, Richie and his mom were having a big argument, and he was crying. She was telling him there were no such things as werewolves, and then they both saw me. Then immediately, everything went quiet and became incredibly uncomfortable. Richie ran upstairs to his room, crying. I nervously held out his baseball cap to his mother. She looked very sad as she came over to me and took it. I turned to leave, but she called my name, and I turned back. She gave me a hug, which surprised me. She told me to take care of myself, and I left. That was very odd. Nothing like that had ever happened before. I didn't understand what that meant until I went back to school and Richie wasn't in class anymore. The teacher told me that he and his family had moved suddenly. That hit me pretty hard, as I could guess why they had moved without trying too hard, and I had lost the one guy who was basically my best friend. Richie moving away without saying goodbye also sent a chill through me because I realized that could have been me if I had told anyone or everyone about the things I'd seen in the woods. Richie only saw one dogman and he was gone just like that. I had encountered several already. I became very withdrawn. I went straight home after school each day, did my homework, then vegged out, staring out my window, looking at the forest behind us. I stopped doing as many things with other friends and slid into a minor emotional coma, which lasted 2 or 3 years, I guess. Nobody seemed to mind. My parents were happy I was doing well in school. The teachers were nice to me. I wasn't having fights with classmates. I had a few friends I hung out with at lunch. They were all from the smarter kids group in the school, and they were all about as socially phobic as I was. I think they probably just went home and did their homework too, but I'm not sure, since we rarely discussed our personal lives. We would discuss certain TV shows and bands we all liked, and other times we'd criticize our teachers, since to be honest, we had often read more about the subjects they taught on than they had. In my senior year in school, a girl moved to town that instantly became part of our lunch group. The first girl we had allowed in. Well, the first girl that ever sat down near us is who she was. We probably would have accepted any girl that wanted to sit there, but nobody ever had before. We all became friends with her, but she seemed to like me best. That made me nervous, yet happy at the same time. She sort of started breaking me out of my social phobia, and I even started going to the movies with her when we could both afford it. I didn't understand how much she liked me, so I didn't even consider these dates. I just thought we were friends hanging out. And I guess that's really all we were. I mean, neither of us ever made a move on the other. I don't think we were ready for that yet. Not at all. Then came the day when this girl, let's call her Marcia, even though she probably looked more like Jan, asked if she could do her homework with me. I was not happy about that. I had come to treasure being alone and doing my work in silence. I'd become stuck in my ways. She played on my sympathy, claiming she didn't understand something in pre-calculus that I grasped easily. I thought then, and I think now, that she probably understood the concepts better than I did, but was using pre-calculus as an excuse to hang out. That made me even more nervous about the idea of bringing her home with me. Even so, that's exactly what I did. I brought her home, and when we got there, she said something along the lines of, "It's such a nice day. Why don't we do our homework out back?" I resisted, but a boy can only resist a girl so much, then he caves in. When we got around back, she caught sight of the woods and let out a little happy noise. Then she ran toward the forest, and I had little choice but to run after her. While I ran, I tried to do the math in my head. I had been in that forest how many times? I'd gone there hundreds of times over the years. I estimated quickly 300 times would be a conservative guess. Yet, I had encountered strange things there only 3 times. So at worst, it was a 1 in 100 chance that anything bad would happen if we went in there. And we were going in there because Marcia had already decided. Somehow, she found my old favorite outcropping of rock and announced that this would be the perfect place for us to study. I didn't tell her that I had decided the same thing years earlier. In fact, I didn't tell her anything about anything at all except whatever she asked me about directly. And the only things she asked me about directly had to do with pre-calculus class. So we spoke of this subject only. Yet somehow, when I had finished explaining a concept to her, I looked up at her, and she leaned in and planted one right on my lips. My eyes went as big as saucers, and in the next instant, hers did too. Not because of me, but because we both heard the sound of a very deep, very guttural growling. To find out what happened next, Come back next Saturday evening for the following installment of Life with Dogman. Up next, we've got your old pal Bigfoot with the next installment of Brian's Lichen Troubles. Right after this.
I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
Brian's Lichen Troubles resume. We now join Brian's Lichen Troubles, already in progress. Jenny did as the hunter told her and tossed the backpack a few feet in front of her in his direction. She prepared to lie down as she had been instructed, but noticed something was wrong, as in missing. Brian had been sleeping to her left in his lichen form, but he was no longer there. Hearing a muffled shout from the hunter's direction, Jenny looked up just in time to see her husband, the werewolf, take him out from the side. Watching, Jenny could see leaves and trees moving. Listening, she could tell from the horrible noises she was hearing what was happening. Grabbing the backpack, Jenny retreated to her tent and zipped up. Then she finally reached into that backpack and grabbed stacks of paper out. Paper money. She pulled it out and stared at it in shock. They were stacks of $10 bills, and the bag was full of them. Jenny wondered if they were stolen or counterfeit. As amazing as it was to hold all that money, she imagined spending it would only get her in trouble. Jenny could hear Brian howling outside the tent and wondered if that meant he had been hurt or if that meant he had won the fight. Then she wondered what winning the fight actually means to a werewolf, and a shudder went through her. She had more pressing concerns than what to do with this bag of money. She had to figure out what to do now. Go out and look for her husband, or continue to cower in the tent. Then fate decided for her, or Brian did, as she could hear him approaching, breathing hard. She unzipped and emerged, and there he was, towering over her. She should have felt fear of the great beast, no matter his identity when in human form. But her only fear in that moment was that he might be injured. He didn't seem to be, but Jenny craned her neck to look up, then to either side and down, searching for anything that looked out of place. Brian reached out a large, clawed hand in her direction, and Jenny ducked. The hand moved past her into the tent and came back out, holding the brightly colored backpack, spilling out some of the money along the way. He handed the bag to Jenny, and she put all the money back into it, then sealed it shut. Brian flipped her onto his back, and now it was Jenny's turn to howl. She knew what was coming next, so she pulled the bag over one of her shoulders and held on for dear life as Brian took off through the forest at faster than human speed. Jenny held her head to Brian's back and gripped his long fur in her left hand with her right around his shoulder, and Brian ran, sometimes on his hind legs, sometimes on all four, under and over and around each obstacle in the woods. Branches whipped Jenny and scratched Jenny and whizzed past her, but she focused every ounce of her concentration on only one thing: holding on for dear life. Suddenly, the whipping and scratching stopped as Brian seemed to have run into a clearing. Jenny looked up and saw that was not what was happening at all. He was running out onto an unlit country highway in the night, and she could see headlights in her eyes, blinding her. She hoped Brian could see them too, but judging by the tire screeching sound and the sudden swerve to the left Brian was making in his running, such was probably not the case. Jenny could hold on no longer and was flung from Brian's hairy shoulder onto a patch of brush which broke her fall. As she got up, Jenny saw Brian crossing the road and disappearing into the woods. He probably didn't even realize yet that she had been thrown from his back. Turning her attention to the car, now parked in the middle of the highway, Jenny saw two large figures get out of the two front doors and begin walking in her direction. They frightened her, and Jenny defensively held the backpack in front of her. "Please place the backpack on the ground and put your hands in the air, miss," called one of the figures. Jenny's heart sank. It must be that hunter again, and now he's got a friend. But she saw something glinting on the chest of one of the men, and quickly understood they were both some kind of officers of the law. Of course, that only made her slightly less frightened, since she was holding a bag filled with either stolen or counterfeit money. Thinking quickly, Jenny asked the cops, do you know who this bag belongs to? I found it in the woods." "Please drop the bag and put your hands over your head, miss," repeated the officer. She now did as asked. "Thank you," said the officer as he knelt down and unzipped the bag, peering inside. He nodded to the other officer, who told Jenny she had the right to remain silent, and began walking in her direction. Jenny's eyes welled up with tears, and she prayed internally that Brian would come back. The officer handcuffed the girl as he continued to talk, but Jenny wasn't listening to him. She was listening in her mind, listening for her husband, Brian. And then, suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, something happened that we'll tell you all about. Brian's lichen troubles continue. Jenny stood in the forest, her hair messed, her clothes ragged, dirty, and torn. The policeman had just handcuffed her, and she was crying. There was a sound like a loud firecracker, and one of the officers saw the brightly colored backpack full of money fly out of his hands. Looking behind, all three of them saw 4 men, each carrying weaponry far larger than that carried by the officers. Jenny froze, and her brain froze. She felt certain this was the end, and she dropped to the ground as well as she could with her hands cuffed, lying on her side. She went into some kind of shock, but a part of her mind registered that time was passing. People were saying things, but she didn't have enough brain power to translate the words into meaning. She just laid there in shock, and time passed, and after a while, she noticed there had been no more loud firecracker sounds. She wondered if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Then, someone was picking her up and putting her in a car. Once inside, she could see she was inside the police vehicle, but that the radio had been shot out. She wondered who was going to get in the car with her, and was sort of relieved to see it was the two policemen. They took her to the station and tried to question her. They could tell she had experienced too much and put her in a solitary cell, locking her in and letting Jenny get some sleep. In the morning, they explained to her that the men had taken the backpack, wrecked their radio, and gone off, leaving them all unhurt. Then they began to question her again about the backpack, and she mostly told them the truth. She never mentioned Brian, as she didn't want them launching a manhunt for him. Or maybe she did. Or maybe she didn't. It was so hard to know what was the right thing to do. If they caught Brian, what kind of trouble might he be in? If they didn't, would she ever see him again? She had to have faith they would find each other again. Although unsure, Jenny stuck with her gut feeling. Tell the cops about your amnesia, the Bible you had with your name in it, and leave it at that. In the afternoon, they good cop, bad copped her, saying they had run a search, and the only two people in the country going by the name she had given them were both over 50 years old. Bad cop shouted at her to stop lying. Jenny cried, and good cop urged his partner to ease up on the poor kid. Jenny didn't tell them any more. She was more frightened in that station house than she ever had been in the forest. She could only cry and pray that somehow she could be back with Brian and that everything could be better. By the early evening, Good Cop came to talk to her in her cell, and he told her that if she really didn't remember who she was, they were going to have to put her in a psychiatric clinic for an extended period of time. Jenny began to weep uncontrollably. She hadn't thought they would do that, but why hadn't she? What else could they do? She had no family other than Brian, and she didn't feel safe mentioning him. The situation was too much for her, and Jenny cried. Good Cop took pity. He told her to wait and that he'd be right back. About 20 minutes later, he came to Jenny offering an alternative plan. His sister lived alone by the forest, and she was willing to let Jenny stay at her place, under her care, in her recognizance, for a month or two. Jenny would be on a sort of probation. She'd have to help his sister around the house, and if she ran off, she wouldn't just get sent to a psychiatric clinic. She'd be sent to jail after that was over. Jenny still wasn't out of trouble, but Good Cop was offering her a place to stay where she wouldn't be pumped up with meds all day and caged like an animal. Jenny didn't feel as though she had much of a choice, and so she went to stay with Good Cop's sister, who we can call Laura. Laura was okay. She was in her 40s and a true survivalist loner type. She had a few animals and no TV or microwave or anything modern, and she had a lot of work every day for Jenny to do. But she was kind and she was fair, and she would tell amazing stories about the woods and the secrets it held each night by the fire before they both went to bed, and repeated the process the next morning. Jenny wondered every day where Brian was, and if she would ever see him again. At night, She prayed for him to find her somehow. Laura knew all about the stars and the constellations and the moon. Jenny asked her when the next full moon was going to be, then counted down the days until that night finally arrived. Jenny couldn't sleep that night. She sat up, staring out the window of her bedroom in the one-story home. The longer she stared, the more her eyes became adjusted to the light, and the more she could see. Yet, still, all she saw was trees and the moon. Jenny grew ever more exhausted and knew she had to get up at dawn. Would she even be able to do all the chores the next day? She wasn't sure, as she was beginning to feel sick from the lack of sleep. Yet the sicker she felt, the less she could sleep. Jenny thought she saw something moving in the dark of the trees. It might be her sleepy brain playing tricks on her. She squinted and stared, but was not able to be any more or less sure of what she was either seeing or imagining. Rubbing her eyes, Jenny tried again and again to see what was out there. And then she heard some branches breaking and looked in that direction of the woods. She could see it. Or him. It was the moon making an outline around a tall body. She couldn't see the features, but she could make out the torso of a large man. And that man had tall, pointed ears. Therefore, Jenny's tired head told her that must not be a man. Therefore, that must be the silhouette of... Jenny had run out of her bed and bolted out of the front door of the small home before she even realized what she was doing. It was the full moon. Brian was a lichen again in his werewolf form. He had come for her, and now everything would be okay. "Brian?" she called for him. "Brian," she repeated, this time in a sing-song fashion. Jenny craned her neck and stood on her toes, trying to see into the woods. She wasn't sure exactly where she had been looking when she was inside. Walking on the damp grass in her bare feet, Jenny started strolling toward the woods. Why wasn't Brian coming out to greet her? Maybe he was afraid to be seen by Laura in the house. Well, Jenny would go see him then. But the entire time Jenny walked on that lawn, she wasn't seeing the dog of her dreams anywhere. She wasn't sure if she should walk left or right. She stopped and sniffed the air. A very familiar odor was coming from her front and right. That had to be him. Walking faster and faster, as she was more and more certain she was heading in the correct direction, Jenny soon came upon the forest. She was just 5 or 6 feet away from the tree line, and the odor of the zoo was much stronger. He was very nearby. There was just the slightest rustling of leaves, and Jenny turned and stared directly into the eyes that she had been seeking. But those were not the eyes of her husband. She didn't know who those glowing orbs actually belonged to, but whoever it was, they were now growling. If you want to hear what happened next to Jenny, come back next Saturday night. Same dog time, same dog channel. Let's get back to life with Dogman. When we last left our hero, he and his maybe girlfriend that we're calling Marcia were sitting on his homework rock in the woods behind his family's house when the two of them heard a very frightening, kind, of growling. Let's rejoin the narrative. I could see by Marcia's slack, open jaw that she heard the same growling I could hear. I could tell from the surprised and horrified expression in her eyes that she was seeing something behind me that she wished she wasn't seeing. I knew this had to be a bad thing. This was not the dark werewolf, not the one who seemed protective of me. That one wouldn't be growling. This had to be a genuinely dangerous creature behind me and in front of Marcia. We needed to slowly and quietly try to retreat toward my house and hope that if we moved slowly enough, that whatever that was wouldn't follow. Very softly, I spoke to Marcia. Leave your books here. Say nothing. Stand up as slowly as you can. Marcia began picking her books up. I said leave them again. Then she picked mine up as well. Standing up, she continued to look into the woods behind me. I wondered what was there. After I had also risen, I finally turned around to see a very tall, very dark figure standing in the trees. It looked exactly to me like the dark dogman, the one which had been friendly up till now. That made things even more confusing. The sky darkened suddenly as I stood there, so quickly in fact that I thought something large had just leaned over from behind me, blocking out the sun. Looking up and back, I noticed the dark rain clouds just as thunder and lightning cracked down loudly both at once. Marcia and I screamed, and the rain began, ice cold. The storm had arisen more quickly than any rainstorm I'd ever experienced. I wanted to run home, but glanced first in the direction of the tall figure. It had grown so dark out, so quickly, that I could no longer make out its silhouette in the woods. But I could make out something I had missed before. Red eyeshine. Red. Another lightning bolt shocked both me and Marcia, and we leaped into the air, coming down, already running back toward my house. When we left the trees, I could see my mother waiting for us and calling to us from the back porch. I remember feeling like my heart was going to blow up, but fear kept me running at my top speed until we were both inside the back door of the house. I collapsed onto the stairs leading up and gasped for air. Marcia, still carrying both her and my books, ran upstairs, through the kitchen, past the dining room, then dropped everything on the living room carpet and fell to her knees, weeping and gasping for air. When she could speak again, Marcia asked my mother, "Did you see it? Behind us?" My mother said, "Yes, she saw it all right." Marcia looked at me triumphantly. "So it wasn't just you and me," she smiled at me. "Your mother's a witness too." "I certainly am," my mother exclaimed. "That was an incredible lightning storm, and we all saw it with our own eyes." Marcia and I both caught each other's disappointed glance. My mother hadn't seen what was behind us at all. She only saw the rain and the lightning. I could tell from Marcia's eyes that she was going to keep talking about it, but I shook my head and gave her a look. She understood what I meant and dropped the subject. My mother got us both some dry clothes. She gave Marcia her old college pullover sweater and jeans, and she had us change into the clothes while she called Marcia's mother on the phone to let her know Marcia would be staying for dinner with us. From then on, Mom really liked Marcia and would allow us as much alone time as we needed. My dad liked her too, although he admitted to me once in private that he was just relieved that a girl finally took pity on me. Any girl. Marcia started hanging out at my place 5 days a week after that, but up in my room, not out in the forest. We borrowed my father's binoculars, and all that fall and winter and into the next spring, we would take turns watching the forest around dusk to see if we could see any of the strange dogs that were at least sometimes out there. Over that time, I revealed all my stories to her about the friendly, dark dogman, and that there seemed to be a variety of unfriendly ones as well. By the end of May, as the weather got warm again, she was my girlfriend, and I was her boyfriend, officially, in our eyes, and in the eyes of everyone else too. So, when my parents threw a Memorial Day barbecue for all the neighbors, Marcia was not only a guest, she was involved in helping both my parents with all the shopping, planning, and food preparation. It turned out to be a really fun day, and the first time our family had ever held a celebration in which I wasn't treated like a little kid. Marcia and I were so relaxed that around dusk, we both took a little stroll in the woods. With all the noise and music coming from the backyard party behind us, it seemed like the safest time in history to find some alone time in those trees. And alone time we did find, enjoying each other's presence, filled with feelings we had never felt before, and genuine hope and excitement for both of our futures. And then we heard it. Not coming from the forest around us, but back at the party. We heard the distinct sound of a very large, very feral dog howling. We gave each other a horrified, worried glance. Then we ran at top speed back toward my family and the party. When we last left our star-crossed protagonist and protagonette, they had wandered off into the woods from a party in the hero's family's backyard. Suddenly, they heard the howl of what sounded like a truly large dog, and the sound was coming from back in the direction of the party. Let's pick up the story there, as told to us by the guy who claims this all supposedly happened to him. Life with Dogman. Life of the party. Marcia and I ran back to the party. I can't speak for her, but I know I was expecting and dreading the worst. When we broke through the last batch of trees and re-entered the backyard, though, all we saw was what had been there when we left. Nobody seemed disturbed at all, and it was as though nothing had happened. We both started asking people if they had heard the howling. They all agreed they had heard it, and it sure sounded loud. Then they went back to partying and joking around and eating and so forth. Marcia and I looked at each other confused and wondered what exactly we should be doing. We should be trying to break the party up, I said, but I admitted I had no idea exactly how we could do that. I feel like it's still in the area, I said. At the exact same moment that Marcia said, I sense that it's still here. We were both noticing that same weird vibe. The dogman was around. It had announced its presence, and it wasn't the friendly one. It was one of the dangerous kind. We couldn't see it, but we were both certain it was there. Somewhere, very close by. Just then, we heard the howl again, even louder and closer sounding. To our shock, it was joined quickly by a canine a little further away and coming from the opposite direction. Even though we now had two large canids announcing their presence in an aggressive manner, nobody at the party cared. One person started imitating the howling in a mocking way, and others were laughing at him. I assume they must have been imagining that this was some neighbor's dog. It's incredible to me how safe and smug most people can be. They complain about the most minor disruptions of their pleasure, and the very thought that they might be in danger while in someone's backyard having a party never seems possible to them. Life to them is like a TV show, and when it occasionally isn't, they claim victimhood and make unreasonable demands of other people they have decided are to blame. It's a society of selfish, short-sighted infants masquerading as adults. Maybe the party will break up by itself, naturally, suggested Marcia. Maybe we shouldn't be worried about it because she was interrupted by a howling from a third direction, quickly answered and joined by the first two howls. Then, a fourth from yet another direction. They're converging on us, I said. When they feel they have enough of them to attack this many people, that's exactly what they'll do. Marcia was growing increasingly more nervous. She left me and went over to a small group of kids that a couple of the parents had brought to the party. I don't know what she told them, but she got them to go play closer by their parents and further away from the edge of the woods. That was a smart idea. While I was focused on the problem, she was taking steps to work toward a solution. I was overwhelmed by her intelligence and basic decency. It felt a lot better to focus on what was good about my species than the behavior of the majority of them, and I felt certain, all of a sudden, that it was going to work out okay. Suddenly, something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. It was a dog's head in the trees, but this dog's head was level with my own. Seriously, I felt like I was going to have a heart attack right there and then. This thing was close enough that I could make out the sunlight, causing the edges of its fur to appear reddish. The eyes were dark, with no discernible lighter areas at the edges. I could see it had full rows of dangerous-looking teeth. Then I noticed that it was drooling. Looking more closely, I could see that wasn't drool. It was colored wrong. Drool isn't colored red. I recoiled in disgust, but that thing hadn't even seemed to notice that I existed. It wasn't looking at me even a little, even when I moved. It was staring forward with more intensity than I'd ever seen from a human being. I mean, its gaze was locked. I followed where it was looking to see what it was staring at, and it was looking directly at the kids that my girlfriend had moved to the center of the party. I jogged over to her and whispered in her ear, "The dogmen are here," I told her quietly. "I saw a dark red one eyeing these kids. Get my mother away and tell her there's a pack of wild dogs nearby that look dangerous. I'll get my dad. Make her believe you." She nodded in agreement. And we each had our mission ahead of us. Convince 2 fully grown adults that the young people should be taken seriously about something that would break up their fun party. Sure, nothing to it. Dad, I said, I need to talk to you about something serious. He scowled at me as I walked toward the back of the house where there were fewer people. Walking over, he asked me if my girlfriend was expecting, or if I smashed up his car, or what it was. I shook my head, and I told him that Marcia and I had seen a dog pack in the woods. They growled at us and chased us back to the party. He actually was listening to me. He shut his mouth and opened his eyes, and he appeared to be taking me seriously. The howling, he mumbled. Exactly, I responded. They're calling even more dogs to come over here and might get really messy if we don't get all these people to go home. We'd better do something about it, Dad said, slowly trying to turn his brain back on and start thinking again. We'd better break up the party. Then we both looked across the yard and saw Marcia with my mother, handing out cake. I thought you said Marcia and you both saw these wild dogs, my father said, unable to hide his skepticism and annoyance. She seems to have rejoined the party. I tried to say something, but he shrugged me off and got himself another drink. I ran over to Marcia, my expression saying all she needed to see to understand the question in my mind. Help us serve cake, she hissed at me. Then the party can break up. Help you serve cake? I asked, stunned. Your mother said the party can't be over until people have tried her new cake recipe. So help us serve the freaking cake if you want to keep these people alive. And then she was gone, big smile on her face, handing out sugar and gluten to everyone there. I decided my time might be better spent monitoring the dogman situation. I walked back toward where I should have had a good view of that dark red dogman and could not make it out. It had moved. They were all on the move, sticking out their positions. For all I knew, it might already be too late. Maybe they were setting up to ambush people on their way to their cars. Why hadn't I heard them howling in a while? Maybe they were already putting some kind of plan into place. And that is when I heard it. Behind me. Growling. But it was not the sound of a growling dogman. I had heard that before, and I would know it anywhere. No, this was not the sound of a growling dogman. This was the sound of 2 growling dogmen. And if you want to find out what happened next, come back next Saturday night for the next installment of Life with Dogman. And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend, we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.